we are in the middle of an everything bubble. Gold is going up, silver is going up, bond market is going up, the S&P 500 is going up. Like I'm running out of superlatives here, but one market that's not doing so well is the oil market. And it has to do with the peace in the Middle East. And I've invited a fantastic guest to help us dissect a bit of the fallout of the peace in the Middle East. I'm super excited that this is happening, but we have to discuss the economic fallout. What does it mean? It's not always pleasant when we have to dissect that, but it is what it is. And I've invited Doomberg back on the channel. We always talk oil and geopolitics. We always try to put it together. And whenever I invite him, like there's something happening in the Middle East. It's always interesting. Our timing is always spot on. Despite scheduling these interviews weeks in advance, there's always something happening that is worth discussing. So I'm really looking forward to this. But before I switch over to my guest, hit that like and subscribe button. Helps us out tremendously, and we much, much appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, Doomberg, it's great to welcome you back on the program. It's good to see you again.
Kai, it's great to see you. As you said, nothing much going on in the world, but we figured we'd get together and chat anyway.
Exactly, right? What are we going to fill the next 30 minutes with? But no, it's insane what's going on out there. It's just too much. We should host 3, 4, 5 hour long podcasts, but that's of course not feasible. So we got to pick some topics. And since you're always on when there's something happening in the Middle East, we got to talk about what's happening there, but also some of the economic fallout. We have to look at it from an economic angle, of course. But first, maybe what's your impression? What's happening in the Middle East? Israel, Gaza making peace. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, but it should be said up front that this is unabashedly good news. We are very much anti-war here for a lot of reasons, and anytime wars are stopped or even paused for an extended period of time, that is something we would applaud. And also, obviously, the release of the hostages and the prisoners on the Palestinian side, which they would call hostages as well, is also unabashedly good news. And I think President Trump deserves credit. His special envoy, Steve Witkoff, deserves credit. And let's hope that the ceasefire eventually becomes an extended peace and that a suitable resolution to what has been a, almost 80, 90-year controversy / war / battle / disruption in the Middle East can finally manifest. We remain cautious, but at the same time, it is just unabashedly good news. We have a slightly different view on how we got here, which is kind of controversial, but this flows from the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. We think that Iran won that war, and we think that Israel needed this peace for military reasons, as well as just the global political pressure that's being put on Israel as well. And so I think that explains why oil is sort of where it is, because the prospect of renewed war between Israel and Iran, we think, is lower than perhaps some believe. We note with interest that apparently Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin had a phone call where Netanyahu asked Putin to relay to the Iranians that they have no intent to embark down a warpath with them. The fact that Putin said this publicly means that Netanyahu was comfortable with him saying it publicly. Iran has received that news, but is still remaining skeptical, of course, because in the last war that I just mentioned, there was a decapitation strike against Iranian leaders just as negotiations were occurring. So lots going on, lots to talk about. Happy to take it in any direction that you think would be interesting.
No, absolutely. No, lots of interesting developments. I wanted to talk oil, but you just threw me a curveball talking about Iran won the war. I think we need to dissect that just a little bit because it is a controversial take. Because here in the West, we don't see it that way, or at least it's not being reported that way. So let's dissect that a little bit. Where are you coming from with that angle?
So we wrote a piece last October called October Surprise, where we noted with interest that Iranian ballistic missiles with targeting capabilities seem to be penetrating Israel's vaunted air defense system. And in that piece, we laid out 4 axioms as to why we thought war wouldn't happen. And it was based around the analysis that all of Israel's electricity comes from basically 5 power plants, and most of Israel's drinking water comes from 5 desalination plants, and all of Israel's natural gas comes from 2 offshore fields. And this is a small list of well-known targets. The sort of geolocations of these facilities are well known. And if Iran has ballistic missiles, with targeting capabilities that Israel can't stop, then we have reached a mutually assured destruction phase. Okay, so that was the genesis of our belief. Fast forward to Israel's surprise decapitation strike against Iran, and the first thing we should say, which we said in the follow-up piece, that we were wrong. We didn't think war would happen because we thought the fourth of those axioms was that Israel's leaders understood they were in a situation of mutually assured destruction and would act accordingly. They clearly did not. They either were not or did not act accordingly. And so when the war broke out, we said to ourselves, wow, if this isn't over in 2 or 3 days, Israel's in a very bad spot. And it wasn't over in 2 or 3 days. I believe on the third day, the Haifa refinery, the large, basically the only large refinery in Israel, was severely damaged. Videos online showing Iranian missiles destroying large parts of that facility. And then on day 3 and day 4 and day 5, we're seeing videos of missiles getting through. And then it becomes a war of attrition, which Israel cannot win. And on around the 5th or 6th day, Israel implemented a severe crackdown on information, censorship. Journalists were not allowed to report on the ground. And that was a big clue for us as well. The war went on. We started to see in open source intelligence checks that we do, missiles still getting through. And we just came to the conclusion that Israel needed the ceasefire. And then the moment that Trump's nuclear strike on Iran was published, it was late on Saturday night, which was a strong clue for us. We called it the Saturday Night Live missile strike. That's like the deadest of dead TV times. And Trump sort of just needed a face-saving way out, we think. And suddenly there was peace, after that strike. And the markets nailed it. The oil markets nailed it. That was a backup source of information for us. So in our view, the U.S. is chronically short air defense missiles. And the U.S. provides Israel with 80% of its air defense missiles. And we subsequently learned that the U.S. burned through 20% of its THAAD missiles, air defense missiles, in just 12 days. The war could not go on. Iran is a very large country with a huge stockpile of missiles. It survived the knockout blow, and the war had become a war of attrition. And that's not a war that Israel could win. And so we think Israel needed peace, and Trump was able to deliver it, although not in the way that everybody thinks.
Interesting. No, it's an interesting debate because it throws, like, the whole Iran situation throws other parties into the mix as well. Russia, China as well. And the U.S. was even negotiating with Russia together in that situation, which was very surprising that the two sworn enemies trying to make peace here, or have a common denominator trying to make peace, and even throwing in China as a security guarantor as well, which would have broadened the whole situation even further if that were to escalate, which I thought was really interesting. Like, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Again, if Israel was on the cusp of destroying Iran and getting regime change and truly taking out their nuclear capabilities, would they have agreed to a ceasefire? Of course not. Again, one of the things, so by the way, there'll be prepare for nasty comments and all this stuff just by me expressing this opinion. There's some subjects you just can't talk about without generating an enormous amount of controversy. We come at our beliefs sincerely. We express them politely, and we're happy to defend them. And if we're wrong, we'll change our opinions. But so far, that mental model has worked very well. And I think that Israel is just not in a position to have a renewed war with Iran. And by the way, it's not just Iran anymore. It's Iran, Russia, and China. Russia just signed a major strategic treaty of cooperation with Iran. China has huge interest in what happens in Iran. Iran is a major supplier of Chinese oil, which China desperately needs. So the air defense of Iran will be, rebuilt in partnership with Russia. Who knows what missiles China is supplying to Iran? Look, we're in World War III. Iran just joined BRICS. Iran is close to Russia and China. Russia and China are at war with the U.S. predominantly. And so we have to view that through the proper lens. Yes, Israel has nuclear weapons. But if Iran can make Israel unlivable with a dozen strikes, then I think we have mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't come to that. It seems like we're further away from it than we used to be. So,
amen. Yeah, no, sincerely, like we are anti-war, and another war between Israel and Iran would be catastrophic for both sides, not just one.
Absolutely. Doomberg, we briefly chatted before hitting the record button, but there's two directions I could take this conversation to, but I might want to link it to one of your latest articles. It's about the EU, and one group we haven't talked about in all of this is the involvement of the European Union. They're not involved in anything when it comes to those discussions, at least not what we're hearing. Maybe the UK to a degree, but that's pretty much it. What do you make of that? Like, maybe zooming out just a little bit, the role of the EU globally in general, it feels like we're just being passed over, probably rightly so. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the UK is not in the EU, of course. And so if we isolate our analysis to the 27 member states of the European Union, I just think the EU is sliding into irrelevancy. Brussels' stranglehold over the sovereign nations that make up the EU is reaching a breaking point. We think that the EU as it exists is unsustainable, and it's going to result in significant political change. And we're seeing this across Europe today. We wrote that piece, was kind of, again, another controversial piece, but if you just look at what the EU has been doing, they have been suppressing authentic populist uprisings across the continent, using all manner of dirty tricks and their total control over the media and propaganda to put down the political grievances of those who have been negatively affected by the European Commission's utter mismanagement of many, many situations, not the least of which is their energy situation. Europe is irrelevant. It's not, nobody consults Europe on anything. It produces no energy. It's deindustrializing. It has a huge opinion of itself. Brussels and particularly Macron in France and Starmer in the UK and Merz in Germany, they keep asking to be seated at the negotiation table. If you had any power, you wouldn't have to be asked. You'd just be there. It's a shame. We have many friends and subscribers in Europe, and Europe can be great again someday, but not on the current trajectory. When you don't produce your own energy, and therefore you don't have heavy industry, and therefore you don't have much in the way of military power, you just don't matter. And nobody's listening to Kaja Kallas on anything of consequence. I think most diplomats around the world think she's rather clownish. Same with Ursula von der Leyen. Just look how she's treated when she goes to China. The E3 is trying to insert itself in various situations, and other than a couple of seats at the UN Security Council that are holdovers from World War II, what does Europe even have? And it's just, again, I take no pleasure in saying that. It's objectively true. Europe is irrelevant.
Yeah. Well, I'm sitting here in Germany and I'm witnessing it on a daily basis. Like, we're not being involved in any conversations, whether it's about the Ukraine, whether it's the discussions that are happening about the Middle East or with Israel and Gaza there. Like, it's absolutely irrelevant. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how can we get back to relevancy without, getting involved in a physical war here? And I don't want to use that term lightly, of course, but how do we become relevant again? Like, Germany lifted the debt brake. Okay, interesting, great, but we're more investing into our own infrastructure here. What do you see? Like, is there a pathway back to relevancy?
Sure, it's not going to happen, but the pathway back to relevancy is to start drilling for your own energy and to restart your nuclear power plants and to negotiate, to accept what is occurring on the battlefield, and to find a way out of the war without escalating. And the window to do that is closing. Many would argue that it's already closed. This should have been done in 2022 with the Istanbul Agreement. Boris Johnson's infamous visit to Kiev scuttled that. I know with interest some of the stories that have been breaking in the UK over the weekend. Not sure if you saw them about Boris Johnson's ties to weapons manufacturers who happened to accompany him on the famous visit to Kiev and put £1 million in one of his private LLCs. It's a very sordid tale, controversial, made the news in Britain over the weekend. When the full history of these past 5 years is written, I suspect it's going to be quite shocking to compare the settled history versus how things were described in contemporary media.
No, absolutely. Like, I just Googled here, Boris Johnson, the £1 million man.
Yeah.
Really interesting. But the third article is actually also interesting and, trying way too many topics together. But I went too fast on net zero, which sort of ties into the discussion. We focus too much on the wrong thing here in Europe, perhaps.
Of course. Yes. Look, I mean, we've quoted these numbers before, but I'll repeat them here. The Statistical Review of World Energy is sort of the energy Bible for statistics. It comes out every June. And the 2024 version of it was just published in June of 25. And conveniently, it now separates out the European Union as its own line item. So you can just see collectively how the European Union is doing. So here's some shocking numbers for you. The European Union consumes 38 exajoules of hydrocarbons, coal, natural gas, and oil. It produces like 5, okay? And so it must import 33 exajoules each year. That's roughly the size of the entire US natural gas production in 2024, which I think is 37 exajoules, just to give you a framework. And when you import hydrocarbons, every commercial entity, from the exploration company to the drilling company to the midstreamers to the, in the case of natural gas, the LNG export facility, the LNG cargo ship, the LNG regasification facility, the pipeline owners that gets it from there to your power plant, you have to pay the cost of capital of every player in the chain before you get to consume that energy. And when you import your own energy, when you import all your energy like that, you're also susceptible to supply shocks. And so, look, if you just look around the world, like energy is life. Energy is the food of manufacturing. Heavy manufacturing is the genesis of military might. China might be short oil, but it burns an awful lot of coal, and that coal is awfully cheap. The U.S. is a natural gas superpower. Russia is an oil and gas superpower. There's not surprising to us that it's winning on the battlefield. Europe doesn't produce energy, so Europe can't be back integrated to heavy industry. It used to circumvent that by having direct access to cheap Russian natural gas via pipelines. That's gone. And so the old model of Germany was cheap natural gas, cheap labor from Eastern Europe, and a healthy market to export to in China. And all three of those now are being undercut. And so what's the path out? And of course, fracking is banned, and the solution is solar and the Green New Deal. And, we're going to, Europe can't be a power in AI. It doesn't have energy. It doesn't have the joules. It literally does not have the joules to rearm. And so unless the physics just isn't defeatable. Like, physics is just real. You can't have steel if you don't have cheap energy. If you don't have steel, it's hard to make tanks. And so it's one of the great mysteries of our time, Kai, is this is so plainly obvious, yet nobody talks about it. It's never talked about it in this language, which I guess is good for us. But
no, absolutely. Like, the only thing we have in Europe is regulation. We got the best AI regulation, but we have no AI.
Correct. Well, you need cheap power for AI. I mean, AI is ultimately compute, and compute is all about power. And so, look, the U.S. is going to be cranking out off-grid natural gas-powered AI facilities. We note with interest the announcement by Bloom Energy today, I guess it was this morning with Brookfield. Bloom Energy makes natural gas-powered fuel cells, which means that they can produce electricity circumventing the turbine shortage from the abundant natural gas in the U.S. Look, as we're talking, natural gas in the Permian Basin closed last week at minus $3 a million BTU. They were paying people $3 a million BTU to take natural gas. It's insane.
Crazy. I can't imagine that happening here. I don't know what my energy bill is these days, but it's around 35, 36 cents a kilowatt hour. That's just not competitive. Even if you add industrial discounts, it just doesn't make any sense. So,
well, where do those discounts come from? Somebody's paying the subsidy, right? I mean, so.
Yeah. Now, let's stay on the energy side, but let's come back to oil, because we always talk about either geopolitics or oil or both. And as we speak, oil is rebounding just a little bit, 2.75% in the green here, crude oil that is, scratching or touching $60 a barrel again. Tell us a bit more, like price developments here in oil. What's affecting the price of oil dominantly here?
Look, $60 a barrel oil is incredibly cheap. Don't forget, you're quoting, a price in dollars as though the dollar hasn't weakened. If you really want to blow your mind, plot a chart that tells you how many barrels of oil an ounce of gold will buy you, and plot it over 50 years. Oil has never been cheaper in gold terms, and even just in inflation-adjusted terms, oil is remarkably cheap. $60 oil today is not the same as $60 oil in the year 2000. You take 25 years of inflation, what does $60 a barrel mean right now? Oil is incredibly cheap because the world has way too much of it. Not only does the world have way too much of it, the definition of oil is undergoing a chemical semantic shift. China is if we took all of the coal that China uses to convert into the liquids, diesel and other liquids, the amount that China uses to do that, the amount of coal China uses to do that would make it the second largest coal consuming country in the world behind China. Right? It is producing an enormous amount of diesel just from coal. Natural gas is being, the engines are being switched to run on clean burning natural gas. They're displacing their demand for gasoline with electric vehicles. There's a shift going on. And so when you have dirt cheap natural gas and relatively cheap coal with a moderate degree of fungibility with oil, the long-term price of oil is lower. And the oil and gas companies are deflationary machines. They're technological powerhouses. It's incredible that oil is $60 a barrel today, with gold at $4,100 an ounce. It's insane.
Just zooming out maybe here a little bit as well, like oil used to be a massive geopolitical factor as well. How relevant is oil still in that global discussion? China trying to, enhance trade with Saudi Arabia, for example. But what role does oil still play here? In terms of petrogold, for example, come to mind here?
Yeah, it's still a huge central role in geopolitics. Energy plays a central role in geopolitics, period. Because energy is life. Lack of energy is death, as Europe is proving, and China would not like to find out. And so it's still central, but I'm just saying, because energy is so important, so much treasure will be invested to find more of it for cheaper, which is why we don't invest in commodities directly and why we don't invest in companies that produce commodities, because the long-term real price of all commodities is lower, which is something people don't quite understand. And I'll explain why. Every once in a while, the world runs short of oil or natural gas or coal, or pick your favorite commodity, and you see a super spike in the price. That's very seductive to investors who are gamblers, right? They're gambling. And so anytime geopolitics heats up, people buy calls and they get ready for the big spike in oil. That's like buying volatility in our mind. You're just going to decay away your premium over time. It's far better to fade super spikes because they always crash than it is to try to time them. But because there's an occasional big leap as a crisis evolves in the price of oil or in the price of gas, people get seduced into getting long them because they think, long-term the price of oil has to go up. Well, no, it doesn't. And a century of data proves it.
No, it's the relevancy of the petrogold, I think, is an interesting term, because China is offering or opening vaults in Saudi Arabia to trade gold with Saudi Arabia and use gold more as a currency here as well. Maybe which is the segue now to talk about the spike in gold that we've seen here, Doomberg. What do you make of the recent spike? Is it just an everything bubble, or is there more to it? Should we be taking gold maybe separately from the other asset classes here?
To answer your question, I need to make an important correction to what you just said, which is gold's not being used as a currency. Gold is being used as a neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade, including the oil trade. And the asset that it's replacing is U.S. Treasuries. The U.S. Treasuries used to be the neutral reserve asset that central banks would park their excess profits in while they were waiting to deploy them or to do something else with them. Before sort of the end of the Second World War, gold played that role. And then after the U.S. got off the gold window, the U.S. Treasuries played that role. And China and Russia have been trying to change the system back to gold since the global financial crisis. And we think World War III started when Putin sold his treasuries and started buying gold. By the way, I haven't done the math yet, but I'm curious to see the change in value of Russia's gold holdings since the war in Ukraine started. And I would bet that it far exceeds the value of the frozen assets that are still much talked about. Another way to look at the gold spike is that gold is what's stable, and it's the U.S. dollar that's going down. In gold terms, if gold is stable, how many U.S. dollars does it take to buy an ounce says more about the U.S. dollar than it does about the ounce. And so one of the things that's kind of unsettling is historically, when the nominal price of gold as measured in the global reserve currency doubles in 18 months. That's typically not good. That typically implies huge changes to the financial system, and it typically implies significant risk of war. And I think we're seeing both of those. And so if gold is going to reassert itself, even if just for the global south, as the neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade, that says a lot about the US dollar system. And I think China, last week was a very important week. We're writing a piece on it again. We have a different view than most. We think China holds all the cards, and Trump had to back down. And we posted as much on Notes, Substack's Notes over the weekend. China basically hit the economic nuclear button last week and asserted itself as the dominant player in the negotiation, the trade war with the US. Trump does not have escalation dominance over Xi. And China told the world that we're done letting the US push us around. And if you're tired of the US pushing you around, you should join us. And I think those outside the G7 will be surprised to see the length of the line joining Xi in his campaign against Trump.
Doomberg, maybe just to catch everybody up, like what happened last week, just to get it so we're all on the same page. It's not just blocking rare earth exports, is it?
No, they went much further than that. They declared that anybody who is re-exporting anything that has even a trace amount of rare earths in them needs to apply with China to get an export license. And the biggest potential victim in all this, amongst the biggest potential victims, is a company like ASML, who makes the highest end lithography machines. Well, those machines are filled with magnets from Chinese rare earths. And if China says, nope, you can't export that machine to Taiwan, or you can't export that machine to the US, ASML has no alternatives. And so right now, the world is going to have to decide between whether they want continued friction-free access to the US dollar system or continued friction-free assets to the necessary commodities that make their economies run. They threw down a severe gauntlet, and it took about 48 hours, I think, for the Trump administration to internalize what happened. And then, of course, Trump posted this famous, what do you call it, Truth Social post, I guess. He posted a very long, quite strange, I would say, missive on Truth Social, declaring 100% tariff on China and all this other stuff. And then we posted immediately, like, Trump does not have escalation dominance here. The world needs Chinese commodities more than it needs U.S. treasuries or access to the U.S. banking system. And so the forcing function of the trade war is going to cause countries to choose sides. And I think people in the West are very much comfortable with the U.S. always being the victor in such confrontations. China's a whole different animal.
Well, the U.S. is also investing billions of dollars back into the supply chain, which they should have done like 20 years ago and not just today, which is a whole different discussion. But the question now arises, and it's a bit puzzling to me, like on social media, I keep reading that the U.S. shouldn't do the same thing that China has done, meaning maybe invest into companies, invest into the private sector to get access to those critical raw materials. I'm curious what your take on that is, Doomberg. Should the U.S. be so proactive in securing raw materials, or should it let the free market do its thing? So,
no, the free market has failed, definitively. The free market has failed to properly price geopolitical risk and environmental degradation, which China took advantage of. We wrote a piece 2.5 years ago called Geopolitical Warfare, where we laid all this out. Because China was willing to degrade its environment in ways that the West would find intolerable, it came to monopolize critical supply chains at the very front end of the economy, which gave them enormous leverage, which they're now using. China is in total control of, like, think about, like, if you're missing sort of critical vitamins and stuff in your diet, critical metals that are only present in small quantities, but in their complete absence, you would die. It's the same thing for the economy. And so, yes, Trump is 100% correct to be urgently working with Western manufacturers and friendly nations to accelerate the reshoring of the supply chains that were so foolishly lost. But, as you also said correctly, the U.S. needs time before it starts bluffing and demanding China, do A, B, or C. And trying to choke China off of AI semiconductors was a mistake. We believe it is only forcing China to invent its own supply chains. Their actions last week might imply that they're further along in the semiconductor race than most in the West think, something we've been flagging a warning about as well. And then last thing I'll say, to get like 5 years ahead of it, there's going to be a glut in rare earths because all shortages are followed by gluts. There's going to be a worldwide massive scramble to build every rare earth facility possible. And one day we'll wake up and there'll just be way more rare earths than anybody needs. And therefore, China, having used this weapon, will have degraded its utility. But for now, they hold the cards. And so, just wanted to put that prediction out there because all shortages are followed by gluts, even when the shortages are artificially created in the way that China is threatening to do with rare earths. And by the way, whether or not they actually withhold them, the threat that they made is what really matters because it's going to cause the reactions that I just described.
Absolutely. No, it's an interesting topic. We've seen that back in 2016 on the graphite and rare earth side as well. So I think history will just repeat itself when it comes to that. So,
yeah.
Fantastic. Doomberg, this is all we have time for. What a wonderful conversation. It's always fun to chat with you. We've touched on many angles, actually, today. Usually we just talk about two. This time, I think we touched like 5-6 different topics. Really appreciate your time. If people still don't know where to find more of your work, where can we send them?
Yeah, I'd like to plug another project we're doing too, if you don't mind, because I think you'd find it pretty interesting. But to your first question, you can find all our work at Doomberg.com. But one of the Doomberg founders and its editor-in-chief just started a Substack called Classics Read Aloud, classicsreadaloud.substack.com. It's wildly different than what Doomberg is, of course, and the name sort of would imply what it's all about. It's wonderful literature, brilliantly read and produced with the same sort of brand and commitment to excellence that Doomberg has, and it's gone over very well. People who have signed up have liked it already, well over 2,000 subscribers. So if you're looking for something different or maybe a break from the news cycle, you could go to classicsreadaloud.substacks.com. And then if you were interested in our work, you can just go to doomberg.com and find everything there. Thanks, Kai. Always a pleasure. And like we said, no shortage of topics to talk about anytime I come on. That's for sure.
Absolutely. It doesn't get boring. And being a podcast host is a challenge these days. So I've said it before, but it doesn't get easier. So really appreciate it, Doomberg. Thank you so much for coming on. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching. What an insightful conversation here with Doomberg. Make sure to check out his Substack, doomberg.com, and also check out Classics Read Aloud. Looks really interesting. I've got it bookmarked already over here, so I'll definitely check that out as I'll be traveling here this week, so I'll definitely have something to listen to here. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't done so, hit that like and subscribe button. And leave a comment. What do you think is happening? Did Israel lose the war to Iran? A controversial topic. Let us know. We do want to hear from you, and we will include it in the next conversation we have with Doomberg. So make sure you use that. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more. Take care out there.